Welcome back to another video from English Einsteins, where you get the best information for your English GCSE anywhere on the internet. In this video, we'll be comparing two poems from the Power and Conflict anthology, which is what you will be doing in your Lit Paper 2. If you like the content, like and subscribe, and also check below for details about getting tuition. So, the poems I recommend you revise thoroughly for the conflict section are Exposure and Charge of the Light Brigade. So what you can do then is, if you get a poem about conflict, you can compare it to one of these two, which you will know inside out. Firstly, let's jot down some key vocabulary for this tutoring session. Pause and write down the spelling, meaning and also noun form of patriotic. If you do the same again, just write down the spelling and the meaning. Then I would like you to complete these sentences. Just a reminder, Tennyson is the poet who wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade. So answer for these sentences then. Romantic poets promoted love of nature, revolution, transgression of rationality, transgression of institutions. Tennyson wanted to promote patriotism and also jingoism, this word here. Pause and get this one written down. Being so patriotic that you support war and violence. So first poem we're going to look at, Exposure. The key points here. We will just zoom in on a couple of quotes that will serve you well. As I read, try to think what the real enemy is here for the soldiers. Our brains ache in the merciless ice-east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. So we've got the merciless ice-east winds, got that sibilance there, personification of the winds. If the winds are merciless, what does that show? It shows they never stop, you cannot get away from them, they are inescapable. Good. Second stanza, watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army. Attacks once more in ranks of shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. The repetition of this refrain we will analyse in more detail in due course. Moving on to Charge of the Light Brigade, key moments in Charge of the Light Brigade. Again, I want you to be thinking about what is the enemy. How can we compare the enemy in this poem to the enemy in Exposure? Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there. Charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre strokes, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. So, in this poem, they've got cannons all around them. Again, the enemy is inescapable. So it's a similar situation to Exposure. They are trapped. But the enemies are different. In this poem, the enemy is tangible, it's physical, it's palpable. But in Exposure, the enemy is intangible. You cannot see it, you cannot escape it, you cannot fight back against it. This is the question we're going to be looking at. Compare how poets present enemies in Exposure and one other poem from Power and Conflict. So, if you get one of these poems, you're laughing because you're going to know these two very well. But if you get another poem from the conflict section, then you can compare it to one of these two that you know very well. Exposure and the Charge of Light Brigade are similar because, why are they similar? They both are surrounded by their enemies. The enemy seems inescapable. Exposure and the Charge of Light Brigade are different because in Exposure the enemy is intangible, whereas in Charge of the Light Brigade the enemy is tangible. Here is the question we're going to be looking at again. So we can always compare the titles of the poems. Exposure, you've got exposure to the weather, the element. He is also exposing the futility of war. Whereas Charge of the Light Brigade, we have connotations of strength, of power, veneration. You've got light, symbolic of Christ, of philanthropy, sacrifice, those sorts of things. Right, the first quote we're going to be looking at then today. The merciless ice-teased winds that knife us. You've got personification of the winds, which makes them seem callous, barbaric, bloodthirsty. So notice straight away you've got technique in red, then you've got an explanation of the effect. Callous, barbaric, bloodthirsty. You can say this personification of the winds portrays nature as not only callous, but also barbaric and bloodthirsty. Murderous, if you wanted to. You've got sibilance, that's repeated S sound, which reflects that they're infinitely surrounded by the winds. Not only does the enemy seem intangible, but also inescapable, thereby depicting war as futile, because they are just like prey to the predatory winds. It's almost as if Owen transgresses jingoism, transgresses this view of war as glorious, probably because he suffered shell shock himself in World War One, and he saw the despair of war firsthand. Okay, let's compare it to a quote from Charge of the Light Brigade, stormed out with shot and shell. And this is a good quote to compare it to because we've got sibilance in this quote as well. It also shows they are surrounded by the enemy, and it makes the enemy seem inescapable again. The S sound, repeated S sound, makes it sound like gunshots all around, almost as if they're imprisoned by their inevitable fate. Tennyson promotes the glorification of the 600 who rode into the jaws of death. It's almost as if he is perpetuating or promoting a patriotic paradigm. Perhaps he uses his influence as poet laureate to perpetuate his jingoistic propaganda. Remember, he was poet laureate. He was chosen by Victoria, Queen Victoria, to represent the empire with his poetry, also perpetuate propaganda potentially. Then we've got two more quotes to compare. Often nothing happens. This repetition of a refrain. Refrain is a line repeated at the end of stanzas. The repetition of the refrain emphasizes not only stasis but also inertia as the common enemy to the soldiers. This constant repetition shows that the enemy is not only perpetual but also inescapable, or perpetual and by proxy inescapable. He expresses the war to be futile, thereby denouncing jingoistic attitudes of Victorian England. Last quote then, honour the Light Brigade. Again, this is a repetition. This time it's an imperative. He's telling the audience what they should do. He's expressing his belief in the veneration, reverence, glorification of soldiers, and by proxy war. Tennyson sees the enemy as disregarding the sacrifice the 600 made. You should always remember them, is his belief. The Lexis light is symbolic of Christ, thereby appealing to the Christocentric audience, further solidifying the reverence they should have for the sacrifice the soldiers made. It could also be symbolic of the paucity of weaponry the men carried, the lack of weapons they had. They were travelling light, you could say, thereby eliciting more compassion and desire to patriotically elevate the fallen soldiers. We feel sorry for them because they travelled light. Someone blundered. They made a mistake. These are the sentence structures to help you in your essay writing. For the first point, both Tennyson and Owen depict, I want you to comment on the similarities between the two poems. Then, where it says however, you write about the differences of the enemies. Then you write a paragraph about exposure using the structure here, and a paragraph about Charge of the Light Brigade using the structure in red. As you can see, there are opportunities to put in contextual information in the noun appositives after the poet's name. So in Exposure, Owen, who fought in World War One, or who transgresses jingoism, depicts the enemy as, and then you answer that. Got some phrases in purple to help you there. I expect 4 paragraphs, so 2 from each poem. And where it says however in Child of Light Brigade, you can say similarly if you have a similar point to make, or on the other hand, whereas. Just make sure you do include one of those comparison phrases. That brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you so much for listening again, and I'll see you next time.